can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sand. And right now, I feel like 100 grand.
You are listening to Inspired Insider with your host, Dr. Jeremy Wise.
You got to think three now. Got to think three. Threes. Taken out for Grunfeld. Grunfeld has Timeout. Ooh, did they foul?
They might have gotten a foul here, too. I believe they did. And Grunfeld, Stanford, don't go anywhere yet. Maybe there is a little magic left. Grunfeld rattles it in. How do you like this? He's lost the handle. It's picked up by Lonick. Loose ball. Diving for the ball. Lonick gets it to Robinson. You got 3 seconds. Lonick's got to take a shot. He fires it up. He got it! How do you like it? Can you believe it? Cardinal wins!
Dr. Jeremy Wise here, founder of InspiredInsider.com, where I talk with inspirational entrepreneurs and leaders. And this is going to be an amazing episode. I have Dan Grunfeld. He wrote By the Grace of the Game. I'm going to introduce Dan formally in a second. But Dan, I always like to mention past guests that people should check out on Inspired Insider. So I had Moise Navone of Mobileye, one of the founding engineers. If anyone's heard of Mobileye, it was acquired by Intel for $15.3 billion. But what's interesting about this story is he talked about the sacrifice, and it wasn't always like that. And he had to go back to his family, tell his kids and wife that he was pulling them out of extracurricular activities. They were no more eating out during this journey. So it wasn't all like sunshine and rainbows. Check that out. Yuri Adoni, the unstoppable startup, mastering Israel's secret rules of chutzpah. He spent 20 years in high tech, over 12 years of being a partner at Jerusalem Venture Partners. Amazing episode. Elon Gold, one of the, I don't know, Dan, if you've heard of Elon Gold, one of the funniest comedians. He's been on Curb Your Enthusiasm, many TV shows. He's got Elon and Israelis, Elon Gold's commercial for Judaism, one of my favorite bits on the James Corden show. Check it out. And Paul Bigham has helped raise over $1 billion for the state of Israel through direct mail. And so check that out, many more. And this episode is brought to you by Rise 25. At Rise 25, we help businesses give to and connect to their Dream 100 relationships and partnerships. And we do that by helping you run your podcast. You know, for me, Dan, the number one thing in my life is relationships. And I'm always looking for ways to give to my best relationships. And I found no better way to do that over the past decade than to profile the people, the companies, and the books that I love and admire. And it's actually, I started podcasting partly because, which is going to relate to this episode, because of my grandfather, who was a Holocaust survivor. And him and his brother were in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. And they were the only members of their family to survive. But what lives on is his legacy. And Dan's going to talk about the legacy of his family through the book, but you could watch the interview of my grandfather that the Holocaust Foundation did on my About page on my website. And my kids, my grandkids, and my great-grandkids will be able to watch that interview. So I see this as leaving a legacy. So if you've thought about podcasting, you should. If you have questions, go to rise25.com and learn more. Without further ado, Dan Grunfeld is a former professional basketball player, a graduate of Stanford University, where he was an academic All-American, All-Conference basketball player. He played professionally for 8 seasons in top leagues around the world, including Germany, Spain, and Israel. And like I said, he's the author of By the Grace of the Game and the Holocaust, a basketball legacy, and an unprecedented American dream. And it's all about, we're going to dig into it, the grips of Nazis to the top of Olympic podiums, to the cheap seats, to Madison Square Garden, and to yellow stars and silver spoons. So Dan, I listened to this book. I devoured it. It's a true masterpiece. Anyone listening to this, if you are listening to this, it should be made into a movie. I'm shocked that all of this is, you see one of those movies and it says based on a true story, and maybe like 5% of it is true. And this one, it'll be like 99% of it is true. And I know you currently work in venture capital with Lightspeed Venture Partners, that they have over 400 investments since 1999. So Dan, thanks for joining me.
Jeremy, great to be here with you, man. Thanks so much for having me.
I wanted to start off with, on this journey with your grandmother, who I think you call Anyu, right?
Anyu, that's right.
Talk about Anyu. And throughout this book, you did a lot of interviews to complete this book. And what was one that stuck out with her and the Holocaust?
Yeah, absolutely. So Anyu, my grandmother, and Anyu means mother in Hungarian. And my dad and my grandmother, the native language was Hungarian. So my dad calls his mom Anyu. I grew up calling her Anyu, and that's what she's called to this day. And she's 96 years old. She lives in the Bay Area, 25 minutes from me and my wife, doing incredibly well. And yeah, she's a survivor, and she lost 5 siblings and 2 parents in the Holocaust. And so I did a year and a half of research for this book, like you said, and I asked every question I could think of, wanting to get the details of her experience, what happened to her siblings, to her parents. And there were so many deep moments. And there was really painful moments, because she was saved twice in Budapest by Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, was one of the greatest heroes of the Holocaust. She saw very difficult things, went through difficult things. The one detail that really sticks out to me from the interview process is something she told me about beauty she saw during this process. And I write about it in the book where she was hiding in a basement, and there was, a lot of, Jewish people who were fighting for their lives hiding. And one night they heard blasts, which they thought were bombs, but someone quickly went outside and saw that it was like fireworks. And she said that it was, everyone got out of their hiding places, went outside and saw these beautiful big golden fireworks kind of light up the sky. And I just remember her telling me how she looked around and kind of, in people's eyes, it came back to them that life was worth living and there was beauty and all these things. And what that was, she would learn later, is that the Allies were lighting up the sky for bombing raids, so bombs quickly started to fall and they went back underground. But there was something about that moment, after hearing about all these hardships and then hearing about this moment of real beauty during that time, that I just thought was really poignant.
Dan, she risked her life several times also, and you mentioned Raoul Wallenberg, and talk about that and what your grandmother did.
So Raoul Wallenberg, as I said, saved her life twice. And so the first way was he issued protective passports in Budapest to Jews. They were called Schutz passes. And so my grandmother got one for herself, and she risked her life, like you said, to obtain 17 others, for people who needed help. So I always tell people my grandmother is my hero, but she is also a hero. And, so she had this protective passport. It gave her some security for some time. After a government change, it was no longer recognized. And she was captured by the Nazis. She was placed in the Budapest ghetto. And at the end of the war, she was in a ghetto with her brother. At the end of the war, Nazis came in with machine guns, and word quickly spread that they were going to kill the remaining 80,000 people in the ghetto. And so my grandmother and her brother raced up to an attic. They hid in there. My grandma still talks about this. There's room for about 4 or 5 people, and there was like 12 of them packed in there, right? Because their lives are at stake. And they waited for 5 minutes, and then 20 minutes, and then an hour, and nothing happened. They eventually went out to check, and the ghetto was clear. Romanian Russian soldiers liberated them, and my grandmother went home, and that's how she survived. And that was 1945. In 1985, a movie came out about Wallenberg's life. And it was in that movie that my grandma saw that it was Wallenberg who raced to the gates of the ghetto, pleaded with the commanders and the guards to call off the massacre. He said, "You'll hang for this. You'll be a criminal for this." And so it took her 40 years to learn that Wallenberg saved her life twice during the war.
Who survived from her family and who did not survive?
Both of her parents were killed in Auschwitz. There were 10 siblings total. She was one of 10. And so 3 of them were killed in Auschwitz. One was killed in a camp in the Ukraine. One was killed on a death march in Budapest. So she lost 5 siblings, and including her, 5 survived.
Did she talk about it all in the interviews, her mindset, to survive? Because there's not a lot of hope when you see all of this going on.
Yeah. And, it's amazing. She was 17, 18 years old, right? So just a young woman, but she does talk about it. She talks about the discipline, and you couldn't be casual about anything. Your life was at stake with everything you did. And so she was extraordinarily disciplined. She maintained that hope and positivity. She always talks about her father, my great-grandfather, and what a great role model he was and how he raised her. By the way, my great-grandfather's name was Solomon. My son is named Solomon after him, so he's a very formative figure in our family. But just kind of the values of keeping faith and having hope, and that's kind of what she applied. And what she also says, which I think speaks to her wisdom, is you needed luck. She'll say, "Hey, I did everything I could, but you needed luck because there was no stopping what was happening back then." And so she'll say there were people who did exactly the things that I did, and they were killed, which is so sad and tragic. So she'll comment on what she tried to do to survive, but with the perspective of so much of it was still out of her hands.
Mm. And there's a really amazing story about how your grandparents got money. Talk about that.
Yeah. This is after. So my grandfather, by the way, he lost everyone in the war, both sisters, parents, everyone. So he came home with nobody. And so my grandparents, people have asked me, because the book is out, when my grandparents met after both surviving the Holocaust. And I answer that truthfully. They met the day my grandmother got back. She didn't have clothes. All she had was the thin cotton dress and overcoat that she'd been wearing in Budapest. And so her brother had been liberated months prior from a labor camp. And he said, come on, my friend who I met in the labor camp opened a store nearby. When he got home, let's get you some clothes. And it was that day that my grandma walked through my grandfather's doors. And so
where was that located?
Yep, that's in Transylvania. So on the border of Romania and Hungary. So my grandmother is from a little village called Mikola. My grandfather lived in the biggest city next to it called Satmar, and that's where my dad was born.
So so her brother brought your mom to his store.
Day she got home, yep, and got her clothes, and they met, and they've been together ever since. And my grandma always says, like, after the war, after that much loss, the repair that was needed was so profound that people started families really quickly. And so my grandparents did that, had my uncle quickly, had my dad 8 years later, and they lived under communism in Romania. So to your question about the money, listen, the communism, nothing can compare to the Holocaust, but communism wasn't easy. It was a very difficult life. And in order to live, you had to transact on the black market. It's the only way to have any type of life. And my grandfather did that. And so they were able to save $1,000 worth of Romanian money and 4,000 American dollars, which were highly illegal. They had friends who were jailed, tortured, or killed for having money. But my grandparents had chutzpah, right? I mean, they survived the war. And so they got, when they were eventually able to leave Romania, they fled as refugees. So they weren't allowed to take anything of value out of the country. But my grandma still talks about this. My grandparents looking at each other and saying, we have to get our money out. We worked too long and too hard. And they did, every cent of their name. So for the Romanian money, my grandfather found out which train was taking them out of Romania to Serbia and then to Rome in the middle of the night.
If this isn't a movie, I don't know what is. You know what I mean? So
yeah, this is a type of movie scene. My grandpa, the middle of the night before they left, with a friend watching. So he walked with him and walked to the train station, forced his way on board the train. He had the Romanian money in his pocket. He found a seat at the front. He wedged it deep under the seat, left the train, went home. No one saw a thing. So the next day when they got to the train station, the communists searched them. They patted them down. They got in my grandma's face and said, do you have any money? Are you carrying anything? She said, I'm not carrying any money. And she wasn't lying. It just was already on board. So they got on the train. They went to Rome. My grandfather hung back when they were disembarking, got the money, and was on his way. So that was the Romanian money. The American money was more of it and much more dangerous. And so this is really the wild one, right? And because I grew up hearing this story, and then when I was writing the book, I was like, geez, this is just incredible. This is worlds colliding. And so my grandmother had a cousin who was also a Holocaust survivor, and he was in Budapest, and he was a production assistant working on movie sets. And there was an American movie being shot in Budapest, and the star of the movie was Buddy Hackett, who's one of the greatest American comedians. He had been on the Tonight Show 80 some times at that point. And my grandparents said, well, wait a second. If Buddy Hackett would take our money out, no one's going to stop him. And so my grandparents approached my cousin. He asked Buddy Hackett, and Buddy Hackett didn't hesitate. He said, if you can give me the money, I will take it out for you. And so, that's a whole other story. My grandma had to sew a false bottom into a suitcase, and they had to transport the money, which was dangerous. They got it into Buddy Hackett's hands. He brought it to the United States. He sent it to my great uncle in the Bronx. And when my family got to America, that was the money that was waiting for them. And there was an extra $50 on top, which is like more than 1,000 today. And there was a handwritten note that said, good luck in America, sincerely, Buddy Hackett.
Wow. And that comes full circle, right?
Yeah, it does, because, 20 years later, when, my grandparents had made good in America, my dad was this big basketball star. They were vacationing in Las Vegas, and they saw Buddy Hackett perform. And after the show, my grandmother was telling the story about what happened. And one of her friends got up from the table, went to the front desk. Somehow he talked his way into Buddy Hackett's suite, and he told him, those Holocaust survivors you helped, they're here. And he mentioned my dad, and Buddy Hackett knew my dad because my dad was a player for the Knicks, and Buddy Hackett's a Jew from New York. And Buddy Hackett said, bring him up. I need to see him. And so they went up to Buddy Hackett's suite. They had some liquor together. They reminisced. And so it was really coming full circle.
Dan, I want to talk about, again, they were stripped of everything. And there was one thing that your grandmother actually brought back.
Yes. So you mean from her hometown?
Yeah, from her hometown.
The war. Yeah. I know what you're talking. So after my grandmother survived the Holocaust, she got home and her house was empty. I mean, they had a family of 10 children, parents, loving, loud home, empty, and it was looted. So there was nothing left. And, my grandma was disoriented and she was looking around, and she found, kind of wedged in the back of one of the drawers in the kitchen, an old metallic spoon. And, they were a kosher family, and it was a spoon my great grandmother used to ladle milk. And that was all that was left, and my grandmother took the spoon, held it to her heart, and she took that, with her, had it under communism, took it to the States, and she gave it to me a few years ago. So now I have it. And, I write in the book, I keep it very close to where I sleep. I keep it in my bedside drawer. And so think about a happy life with a beautiful family of 10 children. And that spoon, was the only physical item that was really left.
Yeah. And they came to the States, and it's amazing what they did as entrepreneurs, right? And talk about what they created with the shop.
Yeah, and I learned so much from my grandparents, and my dad did too. It informed our basketball career so much, my professional career, because my grandparents came to the United States. They didn't speak English. They weren't formally educated. And my grandmother loved to learn. She always says that, but because of the Holocaust, she wasn't able to go to school. When they got here, I mentioned my uncle, who was 8 years older than my dad. And by the way, my dad called my uncle a name in Hungarian that in English translates to my king. That's how much he loved his brother. So my uncle was diagnosed with leukemia when they got to the United States, and he passed away within a year. And so this is probably the biggest tragedy in the history of my family, certainly from my dad losing his older brother, from my grandparents, after losing family in the Holocaust, to lose a son. You can't even express, how deep that wound is. And so they dealt with so much, but through hard work, they were able to build a life. And so, yeah, they opened up after, working some odd jobs, saving up some money, the Buddy Hackett money helped. They were able to open up a fabric store in the Bronx, and they worked maniacally. They just worked. They treated people the right way. My grandmother, she spoke several languages, but she picked up a couple more languages to communicate with the clientele. I mean, they did everything they needed to do to build a business, because what that meant was to build a life. And so my grandfather worked 7 days a week. My grandmother worked 6 days a week. It was both of them, working in the store. They'd make my dad come on weekends, which he really disliked, but they built a really nice life for themselves in the United States. And again, didn't speak the language, weren't educated, lost a son. And so if they can do it, there's really hope for everyone, because it's really remarkable what they built.
Dan, there's one point where they don't make your dad come back to work. I mean, you need all hands on deck, right, with this type of business. Yes. But there's one point where they said, you know what, don't worry about coming back to work.
Yeah. And so, for my dad coming to America as, an immigrant, he also didn't speak the language. He had lost his brother. He went to the playground in New York City to make friends, learn English, and to heal from that loss. He started playing basketball, and he always says, well, that's the way you made friends in the neighborhood, right? The better you were at hoops, the more friends you had. And I could say to him, well, you must have made a lot of friends, because, he had never touched a basketball before coming to New York. And then it clicked, it just happened for him. But my grandparents never saw him play basketball. They were so busy at the store. And my grandfather was a world-ranked ping pong player and a semi-professional soccer player. He was a great athlete, but they didn't know what was happening. And so they got a call at their store one day when my dad was a junior in high school already. And it was his high school basketball coach. He said, hey, you have to see this kid play basketball. And they had never been to a game because the games were in the afternoon, and they would have had to close the store, which they never would do. And so the next week they closed the store early. They went to a game, but not too early, because they couldn't lose too much business. And when they got there, the gym was closed. and the usher at the door said, "Gym's closed and it's full. We can't let you in." And my grandfather, his English was not very good. He said, "We're parents of player, we're guests of coach." And the usher said, "Nothing we can do." And my grandma said, "Our son is Ernie Grunfeld." And the usher's eyes light up. He said, "Why didn't you say so?" Let him in the gym. And my grandma still tells a story that, they looked around the gym and my grandpa kind of nudged her arm and in Hungarian said, "Well, if Ernie's so good, why isn't he on the floor?" And my grandma pointed right to the middle of the floor and said, "Look right there. That's Ernie." My grandfather couldn't recognize my dad. He literally had transformed before his very eyes. And so to your question, it was after that game on the court where my grandpa said, "You never come to the store to work again." Because he saw something special was happening even after that first game. He said, "You work on your basketball, we'll take care of the rest."
And one of my favorite parts of the book, I don't know why, maybe because I could visualize it in the movie, is where your dad basically tells someone to pick on someone his own size.
Yeah, he does. Yeah. So, and my dad was picked on when he came to America, and that's one of the parts of the research that was really kind of powerful, because I knew that, and listen, my dad is 6'6". He's a massive guy. He's an Olympic gold medalist. Like, he's a very well-known, successful guy. He was picked on as an immigrant in New York, and so I asked him, what did they do, and he said, "Well, I remember kids used to tell me to cross the street and I would do it because, they'd point and I would do it. And then I would look back and they would laugh at me and walk away." It was hard for him in New York City. And so when he was kind of finding basketball at the park, he was playing with some friends against an older kid. And, this kid was from the neighborhood, and there kind of a scuffle broke out. And my dad was by far the biggest of his friends. So, my dad tried to defend his friends, and, these high school kids, one of them in particular, threw my dad on the ground, grabbed his head and slammed his head into the concrete over and over again. And my dad never forgot that. Even to this day, he didn't forget it. But certainly as he developed, and then, fast forward, maybe 5 years, he's now the best player in the neighborhood, one of the best players in the city. And that same person came back from college to play. I'll let people read the book to find out what happened next. But let's just say,
to read the book to find out.
My dad got the last laugh.
Yeah. You got to read the book to hear about retribution. That's it. So let's talk about your dad for a second, and why Tennessee?
Yeah. So back then, the Big East wasn't the conference that it would become. And really the great players out in New York City, they went down south to the SEC. It was called the Pipeline to the South. So very common thing to do. My dad's final two choices were Syracuse and Tennessee. And he was one of the most highly recruited players in the country. But he thought at Tennessee that, he had an opportunity to play right away. He loved the coaching staff. Again, it was in the SEC, which was the premier conference. And it wasn't that far from New York. And he says that, his parents, especially my grandmother, was very happy about that. She didn't want him to go too far. And so Tennessee is pretty close, especially East Tennessee. It's pretty close to New York. So for all those reasons, he went down south to Knoxville.
I want to hear your favorite Bernard King story. And if anyone hasn't checked in, I don't know if it's Bernie and Ernie or Ernie and Bernie on 30 of 30 ESPN. There's a whole documentary on it and how close they are and how they played in Tennessee together. And then eventually they were reunited on the Knicks. But, with their relationship, your dad talking about Bernard King, what was a favorite story from your standpoint?
Yeah. So, Bernard is from Brooklyn, and Bernard's a black man from Brooklyn, New York. My dad's the white immigrant, son of Holocaust survivors from Queens, New York. They're a year apart. So my dad's a year older. They went down to Knoxville, and they're one of the greatest duos in college basketball history. So they each averaged more than 25 points per game one year, right? So really legendary. The documentary is called Bernie and Ernie. Okay. A lot of people will it was called the Ernie and Bernie Show. That's what they called it in Knoxville, right? Because my dad was there first. He was older. They called it the Ernie and Bernie Show. You hear people today call it the Bernie and Ernie Show because Bernard became such an amazing NBA player. I mean, he led the league in scoring. He's an NBA Hall of Famer. They were both great college players. My dad was a serviceable NBA player, but Bernard was great. And like you said, they played for the Knicks, with each other. And so Bernard, I call him Uncle B. I talked to him a few weeks ago. He texted me a few weeks ago. He lived up the street from us. So I grew up, knowing about Ernie and Bernie, being with Bernard. My dad tells so many great stories about Bernard. And if you ever want to hear, I was going to say an athlete, but really just anyone talk about someone else in their field with reverence, you should listen to my dad talk about Bernard. Like, it's really cool to hear someone appreciate greatness. And my dad just appreciates Bernard's greatness so much. But he tells a funny story that when they were playing together with the Knicks and Hubie Brown was the coach, Bernard got hurt and just a minor injury. And a few of the players got a little bit more opportunity and they played well, and then when Bernard came back, those players wanted more opportunity and they had a team meeting about it, and it's funny to hear my dad tell this story because he said Bernard was a quiet guy, very respectful, great team player. He didn't really speak up that much, but during this meeting about like guys trying to figure out how do I get more opportunities, and the coach was there, Bernard said, he kind of interrupted. He said, Hubie, who's the coach, don't run one play for me this game, okay? He says, if it's the last 2 minutes, I want the ball every time, but don't run a single play for me because I want everyone to feel incorporated. Don't run a play for me. It's funny to hear my dad say, because my dad says, you know how many points he had? I said, how many? He goes, 43.
Wow.
So it just kind of shows like the greatness,
Yeah, I mean, there's a part, one of my favorite parts of that documentary, The Bernie and Ernie, is where Bernard King talks about your dad. And there was one game, like he, I guess, always had his game face. He was really intense. And there was one game where just subtly, like it seemed like he didn't have the same intensity. And your dad just said a few words to him, like, hey, get up. I forgot what it was. He's like, hey, get up for this one. And your dad they just seem to have each other's chemistry.
And it's really great because they were two of the best high school players and college players in the country playing together, each averaging more than 25, right? It's incredible. Rarely do you see two great players who actually make each other better. So I think that's what was so special about them. And then they had this amazing backstory of both being from New York and overcoming challenges in their own lives. So for all those reasons, it was just a phenomenon. But yet Bernard will say, like, me, Ernie and I had the best chemistry of any player I ever played for. And, to what you said about my dad kind of pepping him up and saying, come on, B, my dad will tell stories about that too. And Bernard was legendary for that, where he would psych himself up so much that he'd be sitting at his locker dripping sweat. That was the mental kind of preparation that Bernard would go through. And so when we talk about sports, life, business, right, that's all applicable, right? How you approach your craft, what you put into it.
I want to hear a lesson that you learned from your dad professionally, because he was, GM for many years and also in sports. And I don't know your favorite sports moment from all the interviews you did with your dad. I have a personal favorite from the book, but what sticks out to you is when you hear your dad talk about his career, what sticks out to you?
Two kind of pieces of advice, but they're not even advice. They're just things that my dad has always said to me. And this is highlighted in the book for sure. One is just, and my grandfather told this to him, if you work hard, good things will happen, which my dad would always say that to me. Cause as you know, from the book, right, I'm very honest in the book. Like, I was an analytical thinker as a kid. And like, I dealt with my challenges, trying to settle into my path with basketball. And sometimes I could overcomplicate things. And he would boil it down to the simple part: work, just work. And so not only is it a commentary on like, hey, you have to work, but it's also like, don't let the other stuff bother you too much. Just, work hard and good things will happen. And the other thing I've heard my dad say so much throughout my life is take the high road. Care like who you are as a person, your integrity, how you handle yourself. Nothing's more important than that. So, just take the high road, treat people the right way, be a good person. Above all else, like, you could score 25 points in a basketball game. You could be a really good student. Like, that stuff doesn't really matter in comparison to the type of person you are. And so those are things that I always definitely have taken from him. And so my favorite sports moment in the book is when my dad wins a gold medal. Because listen, he came, we just talked about his background, coming to New York City, not speaking English, not playing basketball. Roughly 10 years later, standing on top of the podium as a gold medalist for the United States, right? That's why, my subtitle says an unprecedented American dream. It's incredible. And my grandparents, they closed their store for 2 weeks, drove from Queens to Montreal, and got to watch, their youngest son become a gold medalist, after them having survived the Holocaust. So it's really a special moment.
Okay. That was exactly my favorite part. And just to give people a glimpse, who are some of the players on that team? Because there were a lot of people that did not make that team, that Olympic USA team.
Yeah, there were a lot, and I read in the book, as you know, a lot of great players who got cut. Actually, Bernard King being one of them, where my dad was just still to this day, because Bernard was one of the best players in the country. Players like Hall of Famers like Jack Sikma, Cedric Maxwell was the finals of MVP of the NBA Finals. Just a lot of really Otis Birdsong, a lot of great players. But my dad's Olympic team, Mitch Kupchak, Phil Ford, they were from the University of North Carolina. Adrian Dantley, Scott May, that was back, of course, when college players were playing in the Olympics. And so there was a little bit of a different cast of characters. And my dad was a role player on that team. He was averaging 25 a game in college. He averaged like 3-4 points per game, but he stood on that podium and put the gold medal around his neck, and he did what he could to help the team.
What about a GM story? You grew up around the NBA, right? In New York and then Milwaukee. What sticks out to you as a story from the business side of basketball?
Wow. I mean, yeah. So my dad was an NBA general manager for 30 years. So I grew up in and around Madison Square Garden. I remember sitting on the back steps of my house when my dad and Pat Riley were sitting on my kitchen table, for the Knicks, talking about trades, and that kind of stuff is just incredible experiences, things I'll never forget. And of course, my life, being able to go to playoff games and being able to go to practice and be around the players, not only get to know them and meet them, but learn from them. It informed my career so much.
I love to hear some of the either some lessons or knowledge imparted by you from some of these people. I know at one point, Rick Pitino was talking to you. So what did he said something to you as well?
Rick Pitino and my dad worked together for the Knicks, right? After my dad retired as a player, he was a broadcaster, assistant coach, and all the way up to president and GM of the team. So Rick and my dad have known each other for a long time. Rick's known my family for a long time. When I went to Stanford to play, which was my dream school, as you know, I wanted to go there since seventh grade, because a big reason is because my grandmother lives close to campus. And she came to every single home game I played. But, I struggled at first trying to find my way. And finally, my junior year, I found my rhythm, and I was one of the top players in the country in my position. And we played Louisville, and Rick Pitino was the head coach. And this is the beginning of the year. And the prior year, my team at Stanford was the number one team in the country, but I had a terrible personal year. I just couldn't get it together. But, I think this Louisville game might have been my third or fourth game of the season, and I was averaging like 20 points and 8.5 rebounds, right? It was like, I had come out of nowhere and was shocking people. And I actually didn't have a good game against Louisville, but that's beside the point. But after the game, when we were shaking hands, they beat us. Rick Pitino kind of brought me in for a hug, and in my ear, he said, "Danny, I've never seen someone play as much like his dad as you play like yours." And I write in the book, like, that was like, it was like an ascension for me, because I look up to my dad so much, wanted to be a great player like him, and struggled to find my way. But when I did, and to have someone like Rick Pitino tell me, like, you play like your dad, like, I was like, I'll take it. That's all I needed to hear.
What about any lessons, or, you mentioned that you'd be shooting around with like Patrick Ewing and John Starks. Any player conversations that you had when you were a kid that they gave you any lessons or imparted any knowledge on you?
Guys definitely gave me pointers over the years. Even as I got into high school, my dad was the Bucks. Guys like Ray Allen, who, by the way, wrote the foreword to my book. Ray Allen's the top 75 player in NBA history. I remember talking to Ray before I made my college choice, and him telling me about his process of, he went to UConn, and I was, really wanted to go to Stanford, and just talking to Ray about that stuff. But you know what? These guys modeled behavior for me in a lot of ways, and I still just remember what things they did. I remember going to Knicks practice when I was in 8th grade, and Allen Houston, who, is a friend to this day, great NBA player, just playing one-on-one with me and just shooting around with me. And like, he didn't have to say anything, but the fact that, like, after practice, he spent 10 minutes with a kid just to, like, be a good guy. Like, I always try when I was playing. I was never not nearly as good or as prominent as him, but, if I was, playing was playing professionally and overseas, and if there was a little kid in our program, like spend a couple minutes with them, because I was 12 years old then, and I'm 38 years old now, but I still remember that, right? And it impacted me. And so I just took so much away from watching these guys, how they treated me, how they treat each other.
I want you to talk about Ray Allen for a second, because I had to re-listen to the forward of the book. So I listened on Audible, and I listened the first time, and I'm like, wait, I have to re-listen. Is he talking about Ray Allen? And I had to go back, I had to rewind it and re-listen to it again to make sure you were talking about the right person, to make sure in my mind it was the right person.
Yeah, it was the right person. And Ray wrote that, and so people know what an amazing basketball player Ray was, but, few people know that, or at least not enough people know that Ray has been this incredible advocate for Holocaust education, Holocaust remembrance. He saw Schindler's List in high school. He was moved by it. He said that this is not just a Jewish tragedy, this is a human tragedy. And so he made it his mission to educate people on the Holocaust. Every time his team played in DC, he'd bring teammates to the museum. He's been to Auschwitz, and so, and again, I know Ray from my dad being the GM of the team when Ray was a young player. And, we connected, when the book was kind of coming to fruition. And an interesting thing is he didn't know my dad's background. And then you kind of get that from the book, Jeremy, right? Where this is not something my dad has talked about much publicly. And Ray had been to our house, and he said, both of Ernie's parents are survivors. All of his grandparents were killed in Auschwitz. Like, Ray had no idea, and he didn't hesitate. And that's why I tell people, as much as I admired him and looked up to him when I was in high school, I look up to him even more now for the type of person he is.
I want to talk about your career, your basketball career for a second, in college and pro. But another person that stuck out in this book was Frank. Okay. I want to meet this guy, Frank. I want to train with Frank. It made me want to train with Frank. Maybe
be careful what you wish for.
Exactly. After hearing this, talk about your relationship with Frank. And you always had this kind of tenacity and grit about you. So when you met Frank and his impact on you.
Yeah. So Frank was a very good friend of our family's when I was growing up in New Jersey. And he happened to move out to the Bay Area when I got out to Stanford, and so I was out there. My grandma was close, didn't have much family. So Frank would come to my games. He's just a good friend. And Frank trained people for the military, and he's unorthodox, he's eccentric. And he would always tell me, you need to work out with me. You need to see, you don't know what you could become. And I was like, man, I was playing on the #1 team in the country at Stanford. I was like, I got it, Frank. We're doing fine over here, But after I had this really poor sophomore season, I said, you know what? I need to make a change. And after one day working out with Frank during the spring to test it out, I said, well, this is what I need. Because to your point, I was tenacious. I was motivated, and I could be pushed, and no one pushed me like Frank. And so we worked out together all day, every day, like 3 sessions a day for the summer between my sophomore year and my junior year. That's when I was the most improved player in the country in the history of Stanford's basketball program. And so Frank, and in the book, we call him Crazy Frank, and rightfully so, but there's a method to his madness. And for as eccentric and nutty as he is and how hard he pushed me, he always knew when to pull me back. And I learned so much from him, and one thing that Frank told me that always has stuck with me is that he'd always say, and he calls everyone sir, well, men at least, sir. They say, sir, your mind will always give out before your body. When you think you can't do more, that's you thinking it, so you just need to figure out that voice in your head and how to kind of subdue that. And that's true. I pushed, like, just when I thought I couldn't push further, he found a way to push me, but he would also pull me back when I needed it.
I feel like when I see this movie, Dan, Frank will be my favorite character. I don't know why.
We got to figure out who's going to play him, right? Because there's only one Frank, but we'll figure that out. Someone really intense.
Yeah, exactly. And I know, and you correct me if I'm wrong, you've talked about when people ask you, what's your most memorable college basketball game of all time? You say the Arizona game, right?
100%.
And I have a different one for you. Okay. So yeah, I know, like, you got in the zone. It seemed like you'll tell this story where you stopped thinking and you just acted. But my favorite is the Washington State game. Okay. I don't know if you remember the Washington State game.
I remember.
And I want to hear what you're thinking in that those final minutes. And I may clip that into this.
Sure.
It's almost like a comeback story, like overlaying the career in this book, but I'll clip it into this interview. But what was your mentality? Just give people a little background of what I'm talking about, but what was your mentality going into the last like minute or so?
Sure. So when I say the Arizona game, so this is my sophomore year when we were number 2 in the country at the time of the Arizona game. And my teammate hit this improbable 35-foot buzzer beater for us to beat Arizona. We were 20-0 at that point. We became the number 1 team in the country about a week later. Tiger Woods was sitting courtside. It was my birthday. Like, it was the craziest thing ever. Right. And we were having this Cinderella season. I mean, we were good. And, our best player was the 6th pick in the draft after this season. But we had him and a bunch of really solid role players, and we were the number 1 team. So we just had this magical run. So that's when to get to 20-0. When we were 25-0, we were playing at Washington State, in Pullman, which is a very hard place to play. They weren't the strongest team in the conference, but they were up 5 against us with like 20 seconds left. And remember, as I said, I was having a terrible year. I had no confidence. I thought I deserved more opportunity. So I just couldn't really perform. But I was in the game at the end, and my point guard dribbled down. He kicked it to me in the corner.
And you're down by 4 at this. Are you down by 4?
We're down by 5.
5, right.
So think about it. We're down by 5 with like 20 seconds left. So if ESPN now, they say like chances of winning, of losing. Like for us, it was probably like 98% chance of losing when you're down 5 with 20 seconds left. The ball kicked to me. I shot it. I shot a 3. I made it, but I got fouled. So, and then I made the free throw. So now we're down 1. We force a turnover, and my other teammate hits a shot at the buzzer. So now it's like, oh my God, like Stanford, like what's in the water? We win again. And it's funny that you say, what was I thinking? Nothing. And that's why I made the shot. All year, that was my problem, is that I thought too much, and you can't perform. My dad has always said to me, when you're thinking, you're stinking. In basketball, that's true. Like, and it's a joke, right? But it's true. Like, you cannot perform. You don't perform basketball or anything like that with your head, right? And so at that moment, it was desperation, because there wasn't even, we weren't even considering winning. We're just, so I finally shot a shot with a little bit of freedom and carefree, and that's why I made it.
Yeah. Fast forward to your pro career. What sticks out to you as a favorite or memorable game in your pro career?
I won a championship in Spain, and, to win a championship is such a special thing. It really is. Like, that's what you work for. And it's such a hard thing to do. And my dad happened to be there. He was visiting, he was scouting in Spain, and he took the train to watch the game. We won the championship. And I just hugging your teammates, celebrating, like, it's the best thing about sports, And so, yeah, that's something I'll never forget.
And there was a point where you're playing for Jerusalem, right?
Yes.
And it seemed like there was an emotional point when you, I guess, decided that this was it. This was your last game.
I was playing. I spent 4 years in Israel, 2 years in Herzliya, 2 years in Jerusalem. And my last year was in Herzliya. And pretty soon into the season, I was like, I just have no more. I have nothing left. Nothing left to give. And from the book how intense the journey was. Not only wanted to be a basketball player like my dad, but I had loved ones or family. They were the loved ones of my loved ones who didn't get a chance to live out their dreams. They were taken too soon, and that intergenerational trauma is real. And so I always put so much pressure on myself and wanted to succeed in basketball that it was such an intense journey. So by the end, I was really worn out, and I under a lot of stress and trying to come to terms with my career ending. And as you know from the book, my career came down to the last possession of the last game where the results were still up in the air, and my team was in danger, and I was so stressed about it. And it was just a wild journey, and I think it ended appropriately. It ended. There was not a moment's respite during my career up until the very end.
I'd love to hear what you think, Dan, mentally. You wrote some articles on kind of during the pandemic about your thought process of tough times, right? And it goes back to when I actually interviewed Paul Bigham, who I mentioned that raised over $1 billion for Israel. And those are from a lot of them non-Jewish organizations. And he would have to travel to these remote areas and interview these Holocaust survivors who are basically living in the woods,
Really?
in the cold and not having anything to eat in their 80s. And I always think of that interview and thinking like, listen, if these mid 80s women don't have heat in like below zero and don't have food, like who am I to complain? Right.
Yeah.
And so talk about your thought process of just the grit and perseverance. What do you think of when times are tough? And you talk about a little bit in your article relating to the pandemic and comparing it.
Yeah. And I think I write in that article, tough times don't last, but tough people do. And, I definitely learned that from my grandmother, my grandparents, and hope, positivity, such a big part of it. And just, we all have challenges. There's always adversity and everyone's challenges look different, and I write in the book about this very bad injury that I suffered. And of course, nothing compares to the Holocaust what my grandparents went through, but we all have things in our lives that are difficult. And so my life has been no different. And so just staying hopeful, staying positive, continuing to work, also leaning on your support system, right? Because we need those around us to lift us up and to be there for us. And so, through all those things, that's kind of how I think about, perseverance and overcoming obstacles.
And you bring, the sports and what you overcame and what you did into the business world. So I love for you to talk a little bit about some things lessons you learned from there that you've transferred over to, venture capital and business.
Absolutely. I didn't know at the time how transferable the skills are of an athlete to the business world, right? Because think about the life of an athlete. It's about communicating with people and listening and cooperating, making decisions under pressure, problem solving, leadership, as we just said, dealing with adversity. If you're an athlete, that you're dealing with adversity, right? Because there's just no other way about it. And so, yeah, all those things have applied to my professional career and have been very powerful, because I'm used to being in the weeds with people, being under a lot of pressure, working together, trying to figure things out. And ultimately, you want to succeed in business, like that's what it takes.
And, up to that point, your identity is a basketball player. So
Right.
When you decided to retire from basketball, what were you thinking was next?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I love to learn. So I knew I wanted to go back to school. So I spent the last year I was studying for my GMAT, and so I knew I wanted to get a business degree. And I was hoping that by getting that degree, not only would it open up doors, but inside of me, I would learn more about what I kind of wanted to do next. And I was able to do that. I went to Stanford again, got my MBA there, joined a startup early, which we grew, was able to transition to the venture capital side. And so, a lot of things about what I like about the startup world come from what I liked about the sports world, which is it's competitive. Work is at a premium. You can try to outwork your competition. Not saying that everything's in your control, and that's also like the sports world, right? A lot of it is out of your control. But yeah, and meeting different type of people, cooperating with different type of people, I just really enjoyed that. And so yeah, my journey as an athlete, it's kind of now transitioned to my journey in the professional world.
Dan, I have one last question. And before I ask it, I want to point people towards your website and anywhere where they can buy By the Grace of the Game. And one place you could check out all is dangrunfeld.com, which is DANGRUNFELD.com. Are there any other places online or on the web we should point people to check out By the Grace of the Game? I don't know if you have a copy handy, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so people can see it. There it is.
By the Grace of the Game. So we're trying to support independent bookstores. We really care about that. I'm proud to say that the book is sold out, which is a good problem to have. We're doing a kind of an emergency second printing because the book has really resonated. They have copies on Amazon. And so definitely available on Amazon, but just in Kindle audiobook, like you said, just really grateful for people engaging more with this story. And means a lot to me.
How'd you decide on Triumph Books?
Yeah, Triumph is a great publisher out of Chicago. They specialize in sports titles, and they decided on me. They really believed in me. They believed in the story. The acquiring editor actually had read the piece I wrote about my grandmother, with the surviving the Holocaust and linking that to kind of dealing with COVID when it first started. And so they believed in me. They believed in the story. We had conversations with other folks. We had some interest, but I saw some people in a firm who really thought this could be something. And so, I appreciated that, went with them, and I'm proud of that. And, again, the book was a bestseller on Amazon. It sold out. So I hope that, we did them proud, and they've certainly done me proud.
So last question, Dan, and first of all, thank you for sharing these stories with everyone. I just kind of wanted to talk about last is your grandma, Anyu, and just, again, we talked about just so much hardship there, and on the other side of things, how close of a relationship you have, and what sticks out as a bright light as far as your relationship together, and some advice that she gave you.
Listen, my grandmother's the brightest light, and and I actually say that about the story, where there's a lot of darkness, but there's a lot more light, which there is, right? This is ultimately a hopeful, inspirational story, and it's because of my grandmother, and if she can overcome what she overcame and go through what she went through, there is hope for everyone. And it's hard to put into words the kind of the impact she's had on me. I tried with my book, but it's incredible.
She would even go to all your games as well. Right?
All of them. Because I always, she went to every single home game I played at Stanford. And if she was on this call right now, she would interrupt me and say, and some road games too, which is true. She would go to Cal and USC, UCLA several times. But, I think from my grandma, it's just really about how you treat people, being a good person, loving your family, trying to do the right thing, having hope, even through the dark times. And she's the greatest example of that. We've talked a lot today about all the things she's been through, and to be able to remain as positive and hopeful as she has. Like, she has inspired my dad so much. It was a big part of his basketball success. She's inspired me so much, big part of my success on and off the court. And I hope when people read the book, she'll inspire them as well. And I think she will.
Yeah, there was one part of the book that that I feel like embodies that hope or positivity, is when you were thinking about going to Germany and what she told you.
Yeah, I read in the book, I'm probably the only professional basketball player who had to call grandmother to ask permission to sign his first professional contract, right? Because it was in Germany. And, when I asked her, she said, go. And she said, sons are not responsible for the sins of their fathers, which is an amazing show of perspective. And she said, we can't blame this generation for what that generation did, because that's what people have done to Jews throughout history. And that was part of the impetus for the what happened. And so, she just, in every phase of my life, has been this amazing presence, of wisdom, of love, of generosity.
I want to tell everyone they should go to dangrunfeld.com, go to Amazon, check out By the Grace of the Game. It is a masterpiece. Get it for a friend, get it for a family member. And Dan, thank you so much.
Jeremy, thanks for having me. This was great.
What I got, you can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sailing right now. I'm feeling like $100 grand.